The microphone slipped from Steve Harvey's hand. In 30 years of hosting Family Feud, through thousands of episodes, millions of laughs, and countless unforgettable moments, no one had ever seen him like this. His shoulders shook. His eyes filled with tears he couldn't hide. The studio audience, moments ago roaring with laughter, fell into complete silence. Cameras kept rolling, but everyone knew something had shifted. This wasn't part of the show. This was real. Standing at the podium was a man in his early 40s. Short hair, military posture, hands steady despite the emotion in his eyes. His name was Marcus, and he had just said 7 words that changed everything. "I lost my entire squad in Afghanistan." The game board still glowed behind them. The scoreboard showed Red Family leading by 40 points. But none of that mattered anymore. Steve Harvey had stopped being a host. He had become something else entirely, a witness to pain, a keeper of stories, a man who understood that some moments are bigger than television. What happened next wasn't in the script. It wasn't planned. And it became one of the most powerful moments in game show history. If you want to understand how a simple game show became a moment of healing that millions would never forget, stay with us. Because what Steve Harvey did next defied every rule of television. The day had started like any other taping at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta. 2 families arrived nervous and excited, ready to compete for prize money and their moment on national television. The Red family was the Martinez clan from Texas, 5 generations of loud, competitive love. The Blue family was led by Marcus Thompson, a former Army sergeant who had brought his wife, his 2 teenage kids, and his 72-year-old mother. During the pre-show briefing, producers always asked contestants to share interesting facts about themselves. It helps Steve connect with them, sets up jokes, creates those spontaneous moments that make Family Feud feel authentic. Marcus had mentioned he was a veteran. The producer made a note. "Thank him for his service, quick applause, move on." Standard procedure. But there was something in Marcus's eyes. A weight. A distance. Steve Harvey has been reading people for decades, first as a stand-up comedian working rough clubs, then as a radio host, now as one of television's most beloved faces. He can spot pain hiding behind a smile. The show began normally. Steve worked the crowd, cracked jokes. The Martinez family was electric with energy. Then it was time for face-off, and Marcus stepped up to the podium opposite Mrs. Martinez, a grandmother who had already won America's heart with her infectious laugh. "All right, Marcus," Steve said, his voice carrying that familiar warmth. "Army man. Thank you for your service, brother." The audience applauded. Marcus nodded, a small smile. Standard moment. "How long did you serve?" 12 years, Steve. 3 tours in Afghanistan." Something in his voice made Steve pause. The audience didn't catch it. The producers didn't catch it. But Steve did. And that's when Steve Harvey made a choice that would break every rule in the playbook. Instead of reading the next question, Steve set down his card. He looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and asked a question that wasn't on any producer's script. "Was it hard coming back?" The studio went quiet. This wasn't typical Family Feud banter. Marcus's jaw tightened. His wife, standing behind him with their kids, suddenly looked worried. This wasn't what they had come here for. "Yeah," Marcus said quietly. "It was hard." Steve nodded slowly. He didn't crack a joke. Didn't move to the next question. Just stood there, giving Marcus space. And in that space, something broke open. "I lost my entire squad in Afghanistan," Marcus said, his voice steady but barely above a whisper. "IED outside Kandahar. I was supposed to be in that vehicle. Switched shifts with my buddy at the last minute because his daughter's birthday was the next week. He wanted to call her." The silence in that studio was absolute. 300 people holding their breath. Cameras still rolling, but the crew had stopped moving. Even the producers in the control room were frozen. Steve Harvey's face changed. The smile was gone. The entertainer persona dissolved. What remained was just a man, standing 10 feet from another man carrying unbearable weight. "How many?" Steve asked softly. 7. 7 guys who were like brothers. Gone in 3 seconds. Marcus's mother, standing in the family row, had tears streaming down her face. His teenage daughter was crying. His wife had her hand over her mouth. But Marcus stood firm, military bearing holding him together the way it had for years. Steve Harvey did something then that no one expected. He walked away from his mark. Stepped off the host's position. Moved directly to Marcus, closing the distance between them until he was standing right there, face to face, no cameras between them. "Look at me, brother," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion. "Look at me." Marcus met his eyes. "That wasn't your fault." 4 words. Simple. Direct. True. And Marcus Thompson, former Army sergeant, man who had held himself together through 3 tours of combat, through the funerals of 7 brothers, through 12 years of carrying grief he never spoke about, broke. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Steve Harvey stopped mid-show. The entire studio froze. What happened next nobody saw coming. The tears came. Not quietly. Not with dignity. Marcus sobbed, his whole body shaking with years of held pain, and Steve Harvey wrapped his arms around him. On national television, in front of 300 strangers, in the middle of a game show about guessing survey answers, 2 men stood in an embrace that transcended everything else. The audience didn't know whether to clap or stay silent. Some were crying. Others were stunned. The Martinez family, the competing team who moments ago was focused on winning, had tears running down their faces too. Steve didn't let go. He held Marcus the way you hold someone who's drowning, who needs an anchor, who needs to know they're not alone. And he started talking, quiet enough that the microphones barely caught it, but the cameras did. "You're still here for a reason, Marcus. You're still here because those 7 men, they'd want you here. They'd want you living. They'd want you with your family, with your kids, with your mama who loves you. You hear me?" Marcus nodded against Steve's shoulder. "You survived because you still have work to do. You still have love to give. You still have a life to live that honors them. Not by carrying guilt. By carrying their memory forward with joy." The hug lasted maybe 30 seconds. On television, that's an eternity. In that studio, it felt both endless and too short. When they finally pulled apart, Steve kept one hand on Marcus's shoulder. He turned to the audience, his face streaked with tears he didn't bother wiping away. "Y'all," he said, his voice breaking. "This is why we're here. Not for the game. Not for the laughs. We're here because life is hard, and sometimes you need somebody to remind you that you're not alone." The audience erupted. Not in applause for a game show moment, but in something deeper. A collective release. People were standing, crying, holding each other. The Martinez family left their podiums and walked over to Marcus's family. Strangers embracing strangers, connected by nothing except shared humanity. Behind the scenes, the producers were in chaos. They had a show to tape. A schedule to keep. Commercials sold. But Steve Harvey wasn't done. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He took off his suit jacket. The expensive, perfectly tailored navy jacket that was part of his signature look, part of the Steve Harvey brand. He draped it over Marcus's shoulders. "I want you to have this," Steve said. "When you wear it, I want you to remember today. Remember that you told your story. Remember that you're not alone. And remember that those 7 brothers, they're proud of you." Marcus looked at the jacket, then at Steve, and started crying again. But this time it was different. Not the tears of buried grief, but something like release. Like permission to be human. Steve pulled a card from his pocket. His personal business card, something he rarely gives out. "You call me if you ever need to talk. I mean it. You don't carry this alone anymore." The show went on, eventually. They finished the game. The Martinez family won, but they donated half their prize money to a veterans organization in Marcus's squad's name. His family didn't win the game, but they won something bigger, a moment of healing witnessed by millions. When the episode aired 3 weeks later, it broke records. Not for ratings, though those were massive. It broke records for emotional impact. The network's phones didn't stop ringing. Social media exploded. Veterans organizations called it one of the most important moments in television history for military mental health awareness. But here's what the cameras didn't show. After the taping, Steve Harvey stayed with Marcus and his family for 2 hours. Missed his next taping. Threw the whole day's schedule off. He sat with them, talked with them, listened to stories about those 7 soldiers. He laughed at their jokes, cried at their sacrifices, and made sure Marcus knew that speaking his truth was an act of courage, not weakness. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. 6 months after that episode aired, Steve Harvey received a letter. It was from Marcus, but it wasn't alone. Attached to it were 6 other letters, from 6 other families. The families of the 7 soldiers who died in that IED blast in Afghanistan. They had been watching when the episode aired. They had seen Marcus break down, seen Steve stop the show, seen their loved ones honored on national television in a way that felt real and human and true. Each family wrote to thank Steve, not just for that moment, but for giving them something they didn't know they needed: permission to talk about their grief, permission to remember with both pain and love. One mother wrote, "My son would have loved seeing Marcus laugh again. Thank you for reminding us that healing isn't betrayal." Steve Harvey framed those letters. They hang in his office, not as trophies, but as reminders of why he does what he does. Because sometimes, a game show isn't just a game show. Sometimes it's a platform. Sometimes it's a pulpit. Sometimes it's exactly where someone needs to hear that they matter, that their pain is real, and that they don't have to carry it alone. The jacket Steve gave Marcus still hangs in Marcus's closet. He doesn't wear it often, but his kids know the story. On hard days, on anniversaries of dates he wishes he could forget, Marcus puts on that jacket and remembers. He's not alone. He never was. Steve Harvey has said in interviews that the Marcus episode changed how he hosts Family Feud. He pays more attention now. Listens deeper. Looks for the people who are holding more than they should. Because he learned something that day. Sometimes the most important answer isn't on the board. Sometimes it's in the courage to ask a real question and the grace to hold space for a real answer. The legacy of that moment extends beyond one episode, beyond one family. Veterans across the country saw Marcus break down and found permission to break down too. Suicide prevention hotlines reported increased calls from former service members in the weeks after it aired, people finally reaching out instead of suffering in silence. Organizations that support military families saw donations spike. But maybe the most powerful legacy is simpler: a game show host who had every reason to keep things light, to stick to the script, to play it safe, chose instead to be human. To stop. To listen. To hold someone who was hurting. And in doing so, Steve Harvey showed millions of people what real strength looks like. It doesn't look like never crying. It doesn't look like carrying everything alone. It looks like Marcus standing at that podium and speaking 7 words that he'd held inside for years. It looks like Steve Harvey taking off his jacket and saying, "You matter, and your pain matters, and you don't have to pretend anymore." That's the legacy. That's what people remember. Not the jokes, not the game, not even who won. They remember the moment when the show stopped, and humanity showed up. When protocol was broken, and connection was made. When a veteran found his voice, and a host found his purpose, and 300 people in a studio, plus millions watching at home, were reminded that we're all in this together. The jacket. The tears. The embrace. The letters from 7 families. These aren't just details of a viral moment. They're proof that sometimes, stopping everything to see someone's pain is the most important thing you can do. Steve Harvey didn't just host a show that day. He showed up. And Marcus didn't just play a game. He found his voice. That's what makes this story unforgettable. Two strangers who became brothers in the space between questions and answers, reminding us all that our shared humanity matters more than any script ever could.